Zobula was a young woman with a big heart and even bigger dreams. She lived in Mzansi, a small but lively African town where everyone knew each other. Life had never been easy for her. She lost both her parents when she was just a child. Since then, she had been raised by her Aunt Thandeka in a house that never truly felt like home. Instead of love and care, she grew up feeling unwanted, treated more like a burden than family. But Zobula was not one to give up. She worked hard, determined to build a better life for herself. No matter how tough things got, she always held on to hope. Her only true support was her best friend, Naledi, the one person she believed would never betray her. Through every hardship, Naledi had been by her side, like a sister. Zobula trusted her completely, never once imagining that the people closest to her carried jealousy in their hearts, waiting for the right moment to strike. She never had anyone to depend on, so she knew that if she wanted a better life, she had to create it herself. After years of struggling, she finally landed a great job, one that promised financial stability and a bright future. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. The moment she got the call, tears of joy filled her eyes. She felt like her life was finally changing for the better. For the first time, she wouldn't have to struggle to make ends meet. She could finally take care of herself, maybe even help others in need. Excited, she rushed home to share the news with the only two people she considered family, her Aunt Thandeka and her best friend, Naledi. When she told them about her new job, their faces lit up with smiles. But behind those smiles hid something much darker. "We're so proud of you, my child," Aunt Thandeka said, pulling her into a hug. Naledi clapped her hands and cheered. "You deserve this, Zobu. I always knew you would make it." Their words were sweet, their actions warm, but their hearts were cold with envy. Deep down, both Aunt Thandeka and Naledi were not happy for Zobula. They had never truly wanted to see her succeed. As long as she remained dependent on them, they could control her. But now, she had money, she had freedom, and that made them furious. Aunt Thandeka, who had always treated her like an outsider, now saw her as a golden ticket, someone whose wealth she could enjoy without working for it. Naledi, the so-called best friend, felt something even worse: jealousy. She had always liked being the one Zobula ran to for comfort, but now, Zobula didn't need her the same way anymore. She was independent, successful, and happy, and that made Naledi feel small. That night, as Zobula lay in bed, dreaming of her bright future, her aunt and best friend sat together, whispering in the dark. "She has no one else but us," Thandeka muttered. "She trusts us. That makes things easy." Naledi nodded, her mind racing with wicked thoughts. "If we play our cards right, all that money will be ours." Their plan was simple: pretend to love her, pretend to support her, while slowly taking everything from her. Days passed and Zobula continued to celebrate her new job, unaware of the danger lurking within her own home. Aunt Thandeka and Naledi acted even sweeter than before, showering her with love and kindness. "You should let us handle your money," her aunt suggested one day. "We're family. We'll make sure you never struggle." Naledi nodded in agreement. "Yes, Zobu, you work so hard. Just let us help you." Zobula, blinded by love and trust, had no idea that the people she cherished the most were planning to destroy her. She was walking straight into a trap, and she didn't even know it. Aunt Thandeka and Naledi had made up their minds. Zobula had to go. Her success was too much for them to handle. Every day, they watched her wake up with excitement, ready to go to work, full of energy and hope. It made their jealousy grow stronger. They had tried to manipulate her into handing over her money, but she was too kind-hearted to see through their lies. She trusted them completely. That trust became their weapon. One evening, as Zobula sat at the dinner table, happily sharing stories about her day, Aunt Thandeka and Naledi exchanged glances. They had already made their decision. It was time to put their plan into action. They wouldn't attack her directly. That would be too obvious. Instead, they would make her weak, little by little, until she was too sick to fight back. Then, they would take everything. The next morning, Aunt Thandeka woke up early to prepare breakfast. As she stirred Zobula's tea, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small packet of white powder, poison. Just a little at first, not enough to kill her, but enough to make her feel unwell, enough to make her dependent on them. She mixed it in carefully, making sure it dissolved completely before calling Zobula to the table. "Come eat, my child," Thandeka said sweetly, placing the tea in front of her. Zobula smiled, feeling grateful for her aunt's kindness. She had no idea that the woman she trusted was slowly killing her. She sipped her tea, unaware that each swallow brought her closer to death. At first, nothing seemed wrong. She went to work as usual, feeling fine. But by the afternoon, a strange weakness crept over her. Her head felt heavy, her body tired. Maybe I just need rest, she thought. She pushed through the day, ignoring the dizziness that clouded her mind. Days turned into weeks, and the poison continued to work in silence. Aunt Thandaka and Naledi increased the dose little by little, mixing it into her food, her tea, even her water. Zobula started getting worse. She felt tired all the time, her body ached, and she often felt nauseous. Sometimes, she would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and shivering, unable to explain why she felt so sick. Naledi played her role perfectly. "You've been working too hard, Zobu," she said one evening, pretending to be concerned. "Maybe you need to take a break." Aunt Thandeka nodded. "Yes, child, let us take care of you. You don't have to do everything alone." Zobula was touched by their kindness. She had no idea that the very people offering to help her were the ones making her sick. Her condition worsened. She started losing weight, her skin looked pale, and her once bright eyes became dull with exhaustion. At work, her boss noticed. "Are you okay, Zobula?" he asked one day, concerned. "You don't look well." She forced a smile. "I think I just need some rest," she replied, brushing off his concern. At home, Aunt Thandeka and Naledi hid their excitement behind fake concern. Their plan was working perfectly. Soon, Zobula would be too weak to resist, and when that time came, they would take everything. But what they didn't know was that fate had other plans. Zobula sat by her bedroom window, staring at the sunset, her body weak and tired. She had been feeling sick for weeks now, and no matter how much she rested, the exhaustion never left her. The headaches, the dizziness, the aching body. She didn't understand what was happening to her. Was it stress? Overwork? She wasn't sure, but something inside her whispered that time was slipping away. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about her life. She had worked so hard to reach this point. She had fought through so much pain, yet now she felt powerless. And what scared her the most was the thought of leaving this world without making a difference. She had always wanted to help others, to give back to the world that had taken so much from her. But what if she never got the chance? A sudden thought crossed her mind. Her will. She had never really thought about it before, but now it felt important. If something happened to her, who would get everything she had worked for? Without hesitation, she reached for her phone and made a call. The next morning, a lawyer arrived at the house. Aunt Thandeka and Naledi were in the kitchen when they heard the knock. Curious, they followed Zobula as she welcomed the man inside. "Who is this, my child?" Aunt Thandeka asked, pretending to be concerned. Zobula smiled weakly. "I just need to take care of something important," she said. "It won't take long." She led the lawyer to the dining table, and they began discussing the details of her will. Aunt Thandeka and Naledi exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't expected this. Zobula spoke softly but firmly. "I want half of my wealth to go to charity," she said, "to help young children who have no parents, just like I once had nothing." The lawyer nodded and wrote down her wishes. Then, he asked, "And the other half?" Aunt Thandeka and Naledi leaned in slightly, holding their breath. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Surely, she would leave the rest to them. Who else did she have? But then, Zobula spoke the words that sent a cold shiver down their spines. "The other half will go to my younger brother." Silence filled the room. Naledi's heart pounded. Aunt Thandeka felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Brother? What brother? Zobula didn't have any sibling, or at least, that's what they had always believed. Naledi forced a laugh, trying to keep her voice steady. "Zobu, you're joking, right? You don't have a brother." Zobula looked up, her tired eyes holding a quiet strength. "I do," she said softly. "I've been searching for him for years." Aunt Thandeka clenched her fists under the table. This was not part of the plan. They had expected everything to go to them. And now, out of nowhere, there was another person, someone who would take half of everything. They couldn't let this happen. That night, as Zobula rested in her room, Aunt Thandeka and Naledi sat together, their minds racing. "This changes everything," Thandeka hissed. "If she dies now, we get nothing." Naledi's hands trembled. "What do we do?" Aunt Thandeka's eyes darkened with anger. "We finish what we started." Their plan had just taken a dangerous turn. They could no longer wait for Zobula to get weaker. They had to act fast, before she realized the truth, before she found her brother, before she escaped their grasp. But what they didn't know was that fate was already working against them, because the brother they feared so much was closer than they thought. For weeks, the sickness had been growing worse. No matter how much rest she got, the exhaustion never faded. Simple tasks felt heavier, the dizziness more frequent. Something was wrong, but she kept pushing through, believing it was just stress. One evening, she arrived home, barely able to stand. Her head throbbed, her vision blurred, and her body felt like it was sinking. Dinner was already on the table, a warm meal prepared with care, or so it seemed. A comforting voice urged her to eat. She picked up the spoon with trembling hands, forcing down a few bites. Each swallow made her stomach churn, and sweat gathered on her skin. The room spun, the voices around her faded. The spoon slipped from her grasp, and before she could react, her body collapsed onto the floor. Panic filled the air. Frantic voices called her name. Hands shook her gently, but there was no response. A phone was grabbed, numbers dialed, a desperate plea for help. Within minutes, sirens cut through the night, and paramedics rushed inside. Checking her pulse, one of them spoke in a tense voice. "She's unresponsive. We need to move now." At the hospital, the air was thick with tension. Doctors moved quickly, running tests, checking vitals, searching for answers. Hours passed before one of them finally approached the two women waiting outside, their eyes red with fake worry. "The results are in," the doctor said grimly. "She's been poisoned." A gasp. A hand clutched to the chest. "Poisoned? No, that can't be true." A voice cracked with emotion, shaking with disbelief. Another shook their head, whispering, "Who would do such a thing?" Inside the hospital room, heavy eyelids fluttered open. Harsh white lights burned above. A soft voice beside her murmured, "You're awake. You're very lucky." Confusion settled in. A weak whisper escaped. "What happened?" A doctor stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You collapsed. The tests show poisoning. It's been happening slowly, over time." Her heart pounded. Poison? Number. That couldn't be possible. She turned her gaze to the two figures beside her bed, the ones who had been by her side all this time. Their eyes glistened with concern, their hands clutching hers in silent support. And yet, for the first time, something inside her whispered, "Don't trust them." Lying in the hospital bed, Zobula felt weaker than ever. Her body ached, and her mind was clouded with exhaustion. The doctor had said she was poisoned, but she still couldn't believe it. Who would do such a thing? And why? Determined to find answers, the doctor ordered more tests. This time, they didn't just check her blood. They tested everything she had recently eaten and drunk. Hours later, he returned with a serious expression. "We found traces of poison in your food and drinks," he said. "Someone has been poisoning you slowly over time." Her heart pounded. The words echoed in her head. The doctor's voice faded as memories flooded back. Every meal, every sip of tea, every moment she had felt worse after eating at home. Could it be? She thought about the past few weeks. The sudden weakness, the dizziness, the way her conditions seemed to worsen after every meal. It had never happened anywhere else, only at home. The realization sent a chill through her. She looked at the two people standing by her bed, their faces filled with fake concern. "Who could do this?" one of them whispered, shaking their head. "We need to find out." Zobula didn't answer. She only stared, watching closely. The way their hands fidgeted, the way their eyes avoided hers, the way their voices trembled, not with fear, but with something else. Guilt. Her chest tightened. Could the very people she trusted most be the ones trying to kill her? It felt impossible. These were the people who had cared for her, supported her, loved her, or had they? She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed proof. If they were truly behind this, she couldn't let them know she suspected anything. So she did something she had never done before. She stayed silent. She let them believe she was too weak to think clearly. She let them hold her hand, whispering fake words of comfort. She played along, even as her heart shattered. But inside, her mind was racing. If they had done this, they had made a mistake. They had underestimated her. And now it was her turn to play the game. She would wait. She would watch. And when the time was right, she would expose them. Late at night, the house was quiet, except for the hushed voices coming from the living room. Hidden just out of sight, the phone recorded every word, capturing a conversation no one was ever meant to hear. The truth was finally unfolding, and soon there would be no escape. The plan had been simple: earn her trust, poison her slowly, and take everything once she was gone. The voices were filled with greed and impatience. She should have been dead by now, one whispered harshly. Maybe we need to increase the dose. A cruel laugh followed. Once she's gone, everything is ours. The house, the money, her entire life. The recording continued, each word making it clearer that this was never about love or family. It had always been about money, and they were ready to kill for it. In the morning, as breakfast was served with fake smiles and kind words, the truth lay safely hidden in a device tucked inside a pocket. The weight of betrayal was heavy, but revenge was close. The act had to continue a little longer. One last meal together, one last moment of pretending. After leaving the house, the police station became the next stop. The recording was placed on the desk, the play button pressed, and the evidence spoke for itself. The officers exchanged glances, their faces darkening with each passing second. "This is solid proof," one of them finally said. "We need to act now." Back at the house, laughter echoed from the kitchen as two people celebrated a victory they thought was already theirs. The sound of a knock on the door interrupted the moment. Confusion turned to shock as uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. "You are under arrest for attempted murder." Panic erupted. "No, this is a mistake!" Hands trembled, voices cracked, and desperate excuses spilled from their lips. But there was no escape. The truth had already been spoken, in their own voices, in their own words. Handcuffs clicked into place. The air was filled with cries of denial, but the evidence was undeniable. The trap had worked, and justice had arrived. Watching them being led away, there was no joy, only relief. The nightmare was over. The ones who had pretended to care had been exposed. No more lies, no more poison, no more betrayal, only freedom. The courtroom was packed. People from all over the town had gathered, whispering in disbelief. How could this have happened? How could two women, who had always pretended to be loving family members, be capable of something so evil? The betrayal was too much to process. At the front, two figures stood in handcuffs, heads lowered, faces pale. Gone were the fake smiles, the sweet words, the acts of kindness they had used to fool everyone. Now, Aunt Thandika and Naledi were nothing more than criminals, exposed for who they truly were. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The trial had begun. The prosecutor wasted no time. "This is a case of pure greed," he said firmly. "The defendants planned to slowly poison the victim, a woman who trusted them completely, just so they could take her wealth. And we have undeniable proof." The recording was played. The courtroom filled with their own voices. The whispers, the cruel laughter, the cold-hearted confessions. Gasps echoed through the room. People shook their heads in shock. Some covered their mouths, unable to believe what they were hearing. Aunt Thandeka broke down first. "Please," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was desperate." Naledi followed, falling to her knees. "Forgive us. We were blinded by greed. We loved her. We never wanted her to die." Their words rang hollow. No one believed them, not after what they had done. The defense tried to argue, but the evidence was overwhelming. There was no excuse for betrayal, no justification for trying to kill someone who had only ever shown them kindness. Zobula sat quietly, watching everything. She had no tears left to cry. The pain was still there, but she refused to let it break her. She had survived. That was all that mattered now. The judge's voice was firm as he delivered the verdict. Guilty of attempted murder. The sentence was harsh. The betrayal had been too deep, the crime too cruel. Justice had been served. As they were led away, Aunt Thandeka and Naledi looked back one last time, their faces filled with regret. But it was too late. Zobula didn't look away. She had spent years searching for love in the wrong places. Now she was finally free. The town would never forget this story. A lesson had been learned. Greed destroys, but truth and justice always win. Aunt Thandeka and Naledi were found guilty, their fates sealed. But as the town slowly moved on from the shocking betrayal, a new mystery was about to unfold, one that no one saw coming. Rumors spread about Zobula's will. Many had assumed she would leave her wealth to her so-called family. But after everything that had happened, it was clear that wasn't the case. The town was curious. Who had she chosen instead? The answer would soon shock them all. Days after the trial, Zobula sat in her lawyer's office, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The weight of everything she had been through still sat heavily on her shoulders. But she was stronger now. She had made peace with the past, and today she was ready to look toward the future. The lawyer cleared his throat and read aloud the final version of her will. Half of her wealth would go to charity, helping orphan children who, like her, had lost their parents too soon. The other half, that belonged to someone very special, someone she had been searching for her entire life, her younger brother, Kwame. Gasps filled the room. Many had never heard his name before. Even Zobula had only known fragments of the truth, stories whispered by her parents before they passed. He had been taken from their family as a baby, sent to live in another country. She had spent years searching for him, but with no leads. She had almost lost hope, until now. Tears filled her eyes as she listened to the lawyer explain everything. Through months of quiet investigation, they had finally found him. Kwame was alive. He had grown up in a different world, unaware of the sister who had been longing to reunite with him. And now, after all this time, they were finally going to meet. The moment was surreal. She had spent years surrounded by people who pretended to love her, only to betray her in the worst way. But this was different. This was family, real family. Someone who shared her blood, her history, her story. Someone who truly belonged in her life. A week later, she stood at the airport, her heart racing as she watched passengers step off the plane. Then, she saw him, Kwame. He was tall, with the same eyes as their father. The moment their eyes met, there was no doubt. This was her brother, the one she had dreamed of finding for so long. Neither of them spoke at first. There were no words strong enough for a moment like this. Then slowly, he stepped forward. "Sister?" His voice was soft, uncertain. Zobula nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It's me." And just like that, the years of distance, the pain of separation, melted away as they embraced. It was a reunion that had been written in fate, one that no amount of betrayal or greed could ever take from them. For the first time in her life, Zobula felt whole. She had finally found the family she had been searching for, not in those who had raised her, not in those who had pretended to love her, but in the one person who truly did. This wasn't just an inheritance, this was a new beginning, a fresh start with someone who deserved it. As they walked out of the airport together, she knew that the past was behind her. Aunt Thandika and Naledi had tried to destroy her, but they had failed. In the end, love had won, and this time, it was real. The past was finally behind her. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak. It had all tried to break her, but she had survived. Not only that, she had come out stronger than ever. Zobula was no longer the naive girl who trusted blindly. She was a woman who had faced death, looked betrayal in the eye, and still chosen to rise above it. She stood by the window of her new apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The air felt different here, lighter, freer. This was her fresh start, a new place, a new life, a future filled with love and hope. And this time, she was not alone. Kwame walked into the room, placing a cup of tea on the table. "You're thinking again," he said, smiling at her. She chuckled softly. "I can't help it. Everything happened so fast." It was true. In just a few months, her world had turned upside down. The family she thought she had was gone, but in their place, she had found the one person who truly mattered, her long-lost brother. They had spent weeks catching up, sharing stories of their childhoods, filling in the missing pieces of their lives. And now, they were starting over together. Meanwhile, karma had not been kind to Aunt Thandeka and Naledi. Locked away in prison, they had lost everything. The wealth they had craved, the reputation they had built, the life they had once enjoyed. The town that once respected them now spoke of them with disgust. Their names were a reminder of greed and betrayal, a cautionary tale whispered from one home to another. Naledi, once so confident and full of pride, now sat in a cold, dark cell, her beauty fading with every passing day. Aunt Thandeka, who had spent her life controlling others, now had no control over her own fate. Their greed had destroyed them, just as Zobula had always known it would. But she no longer wasted her energy thinking about them. They were her past, and she had no interest in looking back. Instead, she focused on the future. With part of her wealth, she started a foundation to help young girls from broken families. Girls like her, who had grown up without love, who had been mistreated by those meant to protect them. She wanted to give them hope, to show them that their past did not define them. And as for herself, she was finally happy, truly happy. She had her brother, her freedom, and a life filled with purpose. As she sat on the balcony that night, sipping her tea, a gentle breeze brushed against her face. For the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. Greed had tried to destroy her. Betrayal had tried to break her. But in the end, love had won. Truth had won. And that was the greatest victory of all.